My granddad Phelps, my mother's father, used to love to tell jokes, except he wasn't very good at it. And I've come to realize that I probably inherited the same quality from him. I've been told as I get older I increasingly resemble him, and I think I probably got that quality from him. But the way it would go with my granddad was he would hear what he thought was a good joke. He'd begin to tell it, and he started out really well. We'd all be going right along with him and kind of anticipating, where this thing's going to go. He would get to the punchline, and he'd leave us hanging because what he would usually say is, now, I don't know if I remember exactly how this part went. It's like it built up to that, and the most important part you couldn't remember. And so we'd be kind of frustrated with Granddad because of that. I share that because in many ways, as we come to the end of our study of the Gospel of Mark, Mark kind of ends like an unfinished story. And we'll explain that a little bit more in a few moments, but it's almost like the way that really it was intended to end. It's like a story that doesn't quite get to the punchline in a sense. So we'll take a look at that in the first 8 verses of Mark chapter 16. It says that when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might come and anoint him. Very early on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen. They were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, although it was extremely large. Entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right, wearing a white robe, and they were amazed. And he said to them, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He has risen. He is not here. Behold, here is the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. I was kind of hesitant to share this text this morning because, that's the Easter text. And we share it that one time a year. And this doesn't happen to be that one time of the year. And yet I realize it's not a bad idea at all to take a look at it on any given Sunday, because we meet together on the first day of the week. Sunday's the first day of the week. And we do that for a special reason, because it is a remembrance and a celebration of Christ's resurrection. And I think it was Alva Huffer that made the statement that every Sunday is a mini Easter celebration, and I hardly agree with that. That's exactly right. It's too bad that this just gets reserved for once a year. Every time we come together, we ought to be celebrating the resurrection of Christ. So Mark's account that we look at here today is considered to be the earliest account. You say, "I know, but Matthew's first in my Bible." Well, maybe it is, for whatever reason, but Mark is the oldest gospel. So these are the original words. And so I think there is a special ring of authenticity because, again, these are the first recorded words concerning the resurrection of Jesus. And many people know the story very well. There are those who only come to church that once a year on Easter Resurrection Sunday, and they know it well because that's what they hear when they come to church. In fact, those individuals might say that's all the church ever preaches and teaches, because every time I come to church once a year, that's all I hear the church talking about, preaching about, teaching about. So we know the story well, but there's a lot of energy to be found as we look at it again. We know that the story does not start out as a celebration. It tells us that there were some women who went at daybreak to basically finish out a funeral, because that's the task at hand and that's what they fully expected. It says that they had brought spices and oils to complete what we might call today the embalming process. That's exactly what they were on a mission to do. Jesus had been crucified. He had been taken down from the cross very hastily, quickly put into a tomb, and again hastily sealed because a Jewish high holy day Passover was upon them. And it was about to begin at sundown, and so they had to be sure to get the bodies off of the crosses. The Jewish people didn't want to be desecrated because of that, and so that was the setting whereby Jesus was quickly buried. And so the holy Passover day was over, and these dedicated followers of Christ, these women, had taken the spices and the oils, and they were headed off at daybreak to finish the job of embalming the body. We know that the very first obstacle that they encountered, as it says in the narrative, was a huge, heavy stone. It's estimated it might have been 2 or 3 tons. That stone had quickly been rolled over the entrance to the burial cave. It had been officially sealed by a Roman soldier with the mark of the emperor, the mark of Rome. And so it had been sealed. And so that was an obstacle that's not even mentioned in the story. The women come and they're not even worried about breaking the seal, because that's a pretty serious thing in itself, breaking the law, the wrath of Rome. But these brave women were just wondering about, how do we get the stone rolled away? As we read, they got there and the obstacle was already taken care of. The stone had been rolled away. The seal had been broken. A crime, in essence, had already been committed, but apparently it didn't bother them. And so they ventured into the tomb. And it tells us they encountered a young man. What an interesting description. A young man. We understand it to be an angelic being. But they encounter a young man, and I would wonder if that young man was not about the age of Jesus when he was crucified. And it says that when they saw him, as we might imagine, they were amazed. The original language is a little stronger than that. It says they were overawed. So they were amazed out of their senses. And so the young man, it says, spoke to them. He said that the crucified, dead Jesus is risen. And he said, I want you to observe the place where they had laid him. Take a good look at this place where the body was placed before. In essence, he wanted them to notice the absence of a body. There should have been a body there. There was a body there 3 days ago. Notice the place where he had been laid. Dead men don't just walk away. Right away, that's the first compelling proof of the resurrection of Jesus. The body had been taken away and placed somewhere else. All that was needed was to produce the dead body and bring it back to where it should have been. And that would have been the end of the resurrection claim. Instead, it's the great proof that Jesus was risen from the dead. So the angel says, take a good look at the place where he was, where he no longer is. And then he says, go and tell his disciples and Peter. And I think it's very significant that is added there. It's easy to read right over that. Go tell the disciples and Peter. No, wait a minute. There's a lingering over the fact that Peter is mentioned. We say, well, wait a minute. Wasn't Peter a disciple anyway? Why exactly did the young man say, tell the disciples and also tell Peter? Of course, the last thing we know about Peter was the fact that he had denied 3 times that he even knew Jesus. Peter went out and wept bitterly because of what he had done. No doubt Peter himself believed that he was no longer fit to be a disciple. And I would wonder if the other disciples hadn't come to the same conclusion and said, well, we didn't do what Peter did. And so perhaps they never considered him to be a disciple either. But the angel, the young man specifically, wants the disciples and Peter, regardless of what he thought of his status, he wants him to know as well that Jesus is risen from the dead. That statement means that Peter is reinstated. It means that Peter is forgiven no matter what he's done. And out of that rings a great message of hope for us. It doesn't matter what we have done, whether we have denied him, we too are forgiven. We too still belong to Jesus. It is significant that that phrase, and Peter, is included in Mark's gospel, because many consider that Mark's gospel is really Peter's gospel. that Mark no doubt heard firsthand from Peter himself, telling all the events of the life of Christ under the authority and inspiration to record those things as we have them handed down to us. And so perhaps it is in a sense Peter who is saying, that was the message that was brought to me, and so I was reclaimed, and I was forgiven, and I was considered to still be a follower of Christ. Again, as any one of us can be considered no matter what it is that we have done. And so the angel said to the women, Jesus is going to go ahead of you in Galilee, and there you're going to encounter the risen Christ exactly as he said you would. And it says then that they left quickly. You can bet they did. They came there to finish the embalming of a dead body. Stone rolled away, young man sitting inside. All these things that are transpiring, again, they must have been astonished out of their wits, so they left quickly, they fled, they ran away. And it says that trembling and astonishment had gripped them. I like that phrase, gripped them, seized them. Other translations word it that terror and amazement had seized them. Actually, those English words aren't quite strong enough. In the Greek, the words mean trauma and ecstasy had seized them. That's about as extreme as it gets, isn't it? You think about the trauma room at the hospital where the most gravely wounded and ill people are brought in. Trauma, but on the other hand, ecstasy is as high as it gets. So the range of emotions, the depths of trauma, they're scared out of their wits, but yet ecstatic over something they could not have imagined, that Jesus is no longer there, that he is risen from the dead. And so the facts are becoming apparent to them, and they're trying to wrap their minds around what a few moments ago had seemed an absolutely impossible thought. We kind of get drawn into the story when we think about these emotions, don't we? And so they left quickly, it says, because of the trauma and the ecstasy. They said nothing to anyone, because the magnitude of this event was beginning to become apparent to them. In fear, it says that they left in silence. They told no one. And guess what? That's the end of the story. Except you may be looking and say, no, it isn't, Pastor. I see verses 9 to 20 in my Bible, and yep, I see it too. But you might also notice a little footnote after verse 8 that says many manuscripts add verses 9 to 20. Meaning that the idea is that Peter meant, under the inspiration of God, under the inspiration of the Spirit, Peter meant for it to end in verse 8. You say, well, how come we got verses 9 to 20? For one thing, 9 to 20 are not bad. If you look at the other gospel accounts of the resurrection of Christ, there's a lot of similarity. In fact, a few of those verses are identical. Because here's the story, and I think this ought not to shake our sense of the authority of the Bible, and Mark in particular. But most likely what happened is there were some overzealous scholars that said the ending doesn't seem quite right. There ought to be more. And so pulling from some of the other gospel accounts, they filled in the rest of the story later on. But again, the fact seems to remain that when Mark wrote it, as Mark was inspired to write it, it was supposed to end with verse 8. And yet that sounds like an unfinished story if you come to verse 8 that we just read, and that's it. Someone says Mark's gospel ends in silence and Jesus never appears. That's right, the promise was made, you're going to encounter the risen Christ, but if it ends in verse 8, they left in fear, great fear. They didn't go out and tell the other disciples, as far as we know, and they had not yet encountered the risen Christ. So we look at it and say, why in the world would Mark leave us hanging like that? Why did Mark give us such an abrupt and rather awkward ending to this gospel? Well, let me venture a guess. Because maybe the story isn't really over yet. Maybe Mark left it with an open ending because it invites us to jump in and to take our part in concluding the story that seems unfinished in verse 8. By ending this gospel the way that he did, perhaps Mark is conveying the thought to us that Jesus' resurrection is not the conclusion, but rather it is an open invitation to take part in the story. One writer says this, that Mark's gospel ends with the women who have just been commanded to tell the disciples the good news that Jesus had been raised from the dead, has them running off in fear and not telling anyone anything. Roll the credits. The best news the world has ever had has just been given, but the news is never communicated. Mark's gospel ends in silence and in fear. Jesus may live, but the good news dies with the women at the tomb. That doesn't sound very good. So if you want to infuse in your readers a sense of expectancy and urgency, what do? The writer says you end with a cliffhanger. I think that's exactly what Mark has done. If it's supposed to end in verse 8, he left us with a cliffhanger. And I don't know about you, but when I see a movie that ends with a cliffhanger, I kind of hate it. You know, I've seen movies that didn't end right. You have too. It's like the hero of the story finally gets with the girl and they roll the credits. So, well, did they get married? Did they live happily ever after? Did some crisis or tragedy come along after that and they didn't wind up? We don't know. We're just left with all of those questions. And in a real sense, Mark leaves us with a cliffhanger. Because if you only had Mark's gospel and you didn't have the other three, you're left to wonder, well, will the women actually encounter the risen Christ? Will they actually hear his voice? Will they actually go and tell the disciples that they hadn't told? Will Thomas eventually touch the nail prints in the hands of Jesus and believe? Again, will they go out and tell others as the angels directed them to do so? We don't know because Mark leaves us hanging. So in a sense, we are left to do and experience what they had not. Because we know that we haven't exactly encountered the risen Christ ourselves. We're waiting for that at his second coming. So we live in faith of it, but we haven't actually encountered the risen Christ ourselves. And the women, we look at them and say, well, ladies, you're supposed to go out and tell the story. So because they haven't, we pick up the story and say, well, I'll go out. I'll go out and tell others about the risen Christ. And maybe that's what Mark wanted all along, that we're so frustrated that they left it hanging and didn't do what they were told to, that we jump in and say, okay, I'll take it as a disciple of Jesus. I'll go and tell the good news to others. And if that's the case, that's a great application for each one of us. Another writer says that the silence at the end of Mark's gospel is always waiting to be filled in by people of every generation. I like to think that we are the present generation that is supposed to fill in the rest of the story, the unfinished story. And so we are called to go out and finish the story. Seems to me it's just like Mark to end the way that he did because he started the gospel in a rather abrupt way as well. You go back to the beginning of our journey several weeks ago. Mark chapter 1 verse 1 says simply, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so even at the start, we might sense that we're left hanging because we've read the other Gospels and say, well, wait a minute, Mark. No genealogy. Matthew and Luke at least told us about the genealogy of Jesus. Yeah, there's no birth account either. How was it that Jesus was born? There are no shepherds. There's no mention of Jesus in the temple at the age of 12. All we have is just this abrupt beginning, as at the end we have an abrupt ending. So that seems just like Mark to have written the story the way that he did, and perhaps we can appreciate his style as we consider those things. The end of Mark's gospel, the end of his story, we might say is the beginning of our discipleship. And again, I think that's what Mark intended. He left it hanging so that we would pick up to be the disciples who would be faithful to what we are called to. 1 Peter chapter 1. Verses 8 and 9 seem to fit pretty well in the story at this point. Peter, who wrote that letter, who again probably somewhat co-authored the Gospel of Mark, said in 1 Peter 1, 8 and 9, and though you have not seen him, you love him. And though you do not see him now, but believe in him, you greatly rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory, obtaining as the outcome of your faith the salvation of your souls. Mark hints at the unfinished story. We haven't seen him. We haven't eyeballed the risen Christ yet either. That doesn't mean we don't love him, because we do, don't we? In faith, we've seen him and we love him. And though we don't see him right now, though he's not physically present in this room such as we can see, we do believe in him resolutely. And for that reason, we greatly rejoice. We recapture the Easter Resurrection Day joy, inexpressible and full of glory, because we know it points to the outcome of our faith, the salvation of our souls. If Christ is not risen, forget the whole thing. But knowing assuredly that he is, it is a benchmark on the way to the realization of immortality, resurrection, life in the age to come. I so much hope that Mark's gospel, as we have spent a few weeks looking at it, has been a productive time. I can tell you from my experience, it's made a big difference in my life. It has been so helpful for me to take another look at Mark's gospel. It has helped me for Jesus to become more real, and I hope he's become more real to you because of that. That it has helped each of us to see him maybe a bit more clearly through eyes of faith, to love him just a bit more sincerely than we did before we looked at Mark's gospel as we have, to believe even more fully than we did before, to find a greater joy than we had before, to be more focused on the salvation, again, that is the outcome of our faith. I note that many times throughout Mark's gospel, we see the reaction of people to his teachings and to his miracles. And we read phrases like this: they were amazed. They were completely astounded. They were utterly astonished. I hope that we've been pulled into the story so that we've been left also a bit more amazed, a bit more astounded and astonished by Jesus. If Mark's gospel has drawn us in that sense, I believe our time has been worthwhile. If the time we have spent in Mark's gospel has led us to a greater commitment to discipleship and outreach, to finish the story that seems left unfinished, then it has been significant progress for us as a body of believers. If we feel an even greater calling to carry out the task of telling others about the resurrection of Jesus and stepping into the story ourselves, it really has been worthwhile, to my way of thinking.